things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world. Let us all unite!
I am okay.
We are live.
Are we live? Are we here?
We are alive and present.
Is this my mic? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is that better? All right. Okay, sorry about that delay, everyone. Again, this is WRWKLP 93.9 FM, the Work FM, licensed in Midlothian, serving Chesterfield, Enrico, Richmond, Goochland, and Hanover. You are listening to Climate Watch this hour. My name is Stephanie Malady, and I'd like to mention that the thoughts and opinions contained in the following broadcast show are those of the hosts and or guests, and not the staff or volunteers of WRWK-LP FM or the Board of Directors of Synergy Project. So, if Ron gives me the thumbs up that sounds a lot better than the first minute or so, if we're getting close, then we will go ahead and get started with what we've got for today.
We're getting close. We're getting closer.
All right. Can you... I don't hear me, but do you hear me?
Of course, I'm cheating because I'm sitting next to you.
Yeah, I could whisper and see if you can hear my whisper.
I can hear you now.
Okay, better? All right.
You're not registering on my scale, though.
On the board? Yeah, how about now? Now? And
now?
Ooh,
gotcha.
There we
gotcha.
go. Yeah, I can hear myself a little better now. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not really sure. Okay, and if I can get the mic to stay in place. Okay, well, we'll go on. I'm going to say one more time. This is WRWKLP 93.9 FM, the Work FM, licensed in Midlothian, serving Chesterfield, Enrico, Richmond, Goochland, and Hanover. This is Climate Watch. I am Stephanie Malady, and last week I made a commitment to our listeners that I would get the names and numbers of climate-related legislation intended to address the existential threats of the human-induced climate and ecological crisis we now face. And that commitment was easier to say than to do, but we had some success. I had some success. Right now, the challenges of conducting a regular, what we think of as a regular General Assembly session, taking place in the midst of a pandemic, has been making some considerable some challenges for our legislative system that's continuing to struggle to meet those demands. Nevertheless, they are working diligently, and they have managed to produce a fair amount of the documentation required to keep we, the public, informed on legislation sponsored by our state delegates and senators during what will be a very short and very quick 30-day session. General Assembly members have been restricted to sponsoring no more than 7 bills in the House and 10 in the Senate. And due to these constraints, I think there's been some last-minute strategizing, possibly by some what I would think of as collaborative lawmakers, that appears to have resulted in the consolidation of some bills and possibly some shelving of others. challenges continue. Despite all that, for me, the best news is the resubmission of House Joint Resolution number 559, a declaration of global warming caused by human activity causing a climate and ecological emergency, aka telling the truth. That resolution is sponsored by Delegate Elizabeth Guzman, the same delegate who sponsored a similar resolution last regular season. The declaration is an abundance of verifiable facts, solid science, and expert analysis. And it goes something like this. I've taken out the whereases, but it is a lengthy resolution. But I think it's important to hear the resolution. I know a lot of times these things are, what do they call it? The readings are passed by on or whatever, and hopefully the delegates and the senators are reading them, but they don't necessarily get read on the floor procedurally as they're allowed to at sometimes. But I think that what's contained in this resolution needs to be said, needs to be heard, needs to be hopefully understood and appreciated in order for us to understand just what it means for us to say that we are in a climate and ecological emergency. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually understand what it is. So, this is what it is. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences determined that the worst-case climate model of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as RCP 8.5, was the most useful choice for government planning in the period leading up to 2050. All right, I'm going to pause there for a second. That's just the first sentence of the resolution, and it's a whopper. Even that sentence, if you're not familiar with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what the RCP 8.5 stands for, that is the most dire, as they said, the worst-case climate model. It involves 8.5 watts per meter squared, which doesn't mean a whole lot to the average citizen either, of heating that most likely will result in atmospheric carbon parts per million, which if you have been with us in the past here at Climate Watch, that's a common phrase that some of you are becoming acquainted with, even though you may not be in the scientific community on a regular basis talking about these things. Atmospheric carbon parts per million is a measure of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Pre-industrially, that level had been around 250, 280, depending on where you start your count. And in the last century or so, has been climbing steadily and recently at an increased rate, above 300, above 350, and now above 400 parts per million. And so that's where we are now, a little over 400 parts per million, and a RCP 8.5 worst-case climate scenario means an estimated rise in atmospheric carbon parts per million above 900 parts per million by the end of this century, resulting consequentially in 5 or 6 degrees of warming. You heard me right, 5 or 6 degrees of warming. And if you've been paying attention to climate change, we're at 1, 1.5 is bad, 2 is really bad, anything above that is essentially catastrophic. Game over, runaway warming, likely. And,
no more coastline.
Yeah. Okay, so I took a pretty big detour from the resolution right out of the gate, but that pretty much sets the tone there in that first announcement of the facts, of the reality of where we are, verified, confirmed, supported by the National Academy of Science. Okay. The resolution goes on to say, the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season was the 5th year in a row for above-average storm activity and the most volatile hurricane season on record, with 30 named storms, a number that is 2.5 times the seasonal average. 2.5 times the seasonal average. In January of 2020, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Centers for Environmental Information reported that all 5 of the preceding years were the hottest years on record, and that 2019 was the 43rd consecutive year with global land and ocean temperatures above average. Okay, in January of 2020, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, announced that the previous decade of 2010 through 2019 was the hottest ever recorded. Again, I am simply reading the body of the resolution outlining the emergencies that we're facing. Global atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, the primary heat-trapping or greenhouse gas, has 1. Increased more than 45% since pre-industrial times, primarily due to human activities, including the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. 2. Are rising at a rate of roughly 2.5 parts per million annually. 3. Must be reduced to not more than 350 parts per million and likely lower if, and I'm quoting, there's a quote within the resolution, if humanity wishes to preserve a planet similar to that on which If humanity wishes to preserve a planet similar to that on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Mangled that completely. But that's a statement according to the former NASA administration climate scientologist or climatologist, Dr. James Hansen.
Wow.
Continuing. Global atmospheric concentrations of other more potent greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, and hydrofluorocarbons, have also increased substantially since pre-industrial times, primarily due to human activities, including the burning of fossil fuels. Are you guys starting to see a pattern here? In November of 2018, the United States' 4th National Climate Assessment was released, detailing the massive threat the climate change due to global warming poses to infrastructure, property, industry, recreation, natural resources, agricultural systems, human health and safety, and the quality of life in the United States. The effects of climate change caused by a global rise in temperature of 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels is already having dangerous effects on human populations and the environment, including ocean warming, rising seas, ocean acidification, extraordinary biodiversity loss, floods, droughts, devastating wildfires, and extreme weather. In May of 2019, the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found that human-induced climate change is pushing the planet towards the 6th mass species extinction, threatening the food security, water supply, and well-being of billions of people. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has found wide-ranging, acute, and fatal public health consequences from climate change that affect communities across the United States. The consequences of climate change already disproportionately affect frontline communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, and low-income communities, and endangered populations made especially vulnerable by existing exposure to extreme weather events, such as children, the elderly, and individuals with pre-existing disabilities or health conditions. In January of 2019, the U.S. Department of Defense stated that the effects of a changing climate are a national security issue with potential impacts to Department of Defense missions, operational plans, and installations. The U.S. Department of Defense has referred to climate change as a threat multiplier that has the potential to exacerbate many of the challenges of the United States already confronting, including conflicts over scarce resources, conditions conducive to violent extremism, and the spread of infectious diseases, and has the potential to produce new, unforeseeable challenges in the future. Real-world observations and current climate science demonstrate that the environment, economies, and communities of Virginia have been affected and will continue to be affected by climate change in the form of rising seas and retreating shores, endangering low-lying coastal towns and areas such as Tangier and Hampton Roads, saltwater intrusion caused by rising sea levels, disrupting the ecology and health of freshwater aquifers, increased extreme weather events, exacerbating flooding and threatening vulnerable communities and critical infrastructure, damage to coastal ecosystems in the form of diminishing tidal marshes, disappearing bay beaches, and rising water temperatures, all of which harm marine organisms, bird species, and commercially important fisheries, such as the Chesapeake Bay. Longer wildfire seasons and more frequent droughts, threatening the forest ecosystems and communities of southern Appalachia, and increased risk of harm to human health, such as heat strokes and heat-related illnesses. The agricultural sector, the single largest industry in Virginia and the provider of more than 357,000 jobs, is dependent on favorable climate conditions and grows more vulnerable in the increasing impacts of climate change, including changing precipitation and temperature patterns and a higher frequency of drought and flooding. In January of 2019, the U.S. Department of Defense published a report that identified 6 operationally critical military installations in Virginia directly threatened by the effects of climate change, including reoccurring flooding, drought, and wildfires, and the same report identifies the United States Navy operations in the greater Hampton Roads area, home of Naval Station Norfolk, the world's largest naval station, as, quote, very vulnerable to flooding caused by rising sea levels and land subsidence, unquote, challenging the readiness of the United States Navy personnel and operations. In April of 2016, world leaders representing 175 countries recognized the urgent need to combat climate change by signing the Paris Agreement, agreeing to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In October of 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projected that the Earth would warm 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as early as 2030, resulting in irreversible, catastrophic changes to public health, livelihoods, quality of life, food security, water supplies, human security, and economic growth. And the same report found that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide to fall roughly 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reaching net zero around 2050, in which any remaining emissions would need to be balanced by the removal of carbon dioxide from the air. In November of 2019, the United Nations Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report found that countries have collectively failed to stop the growth of global greenhouse gas emissions since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016. At the current rate of emissions, temperatures are expected to rise 3.2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. And incremental changes will not be enough, and there is a need for rapid and transformational action, underscoring the need for immediate climate emergency action at all levels of government. In the absence of significant accountability, acknowledgement, action, and leadership at a federal level regarding the climate crisis, it is the obligation of Virginia to mobilize at emergency speed to restore a safe climate and environment for the health, lives, environment, and economies of rural, urban, and suburban communities across Virginia. Emergency mobilization would require massive, comprehensive, and immediate governmental action on a scale not seen since World War II to attain the level of zero greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors in response to the severe existing and projected environmental, economic, social, public health, and security threats posed by the climate crisis. Justice requires that frontline and marginalized communities, which have historically borne the brunt of the effects of climate change, participate actively in the planning and implementation of this mobilization effort. The massive scope and scale of action necessary to stabilize the climate will require unprecedented levels of public awareness, engagement, and deliberation to develop and implement effective, just, and equitable policies to address the climate crisis. More than 1,200 local jurisdictions and governments in 26 countries, representing more than 798 million people, including the governments of New York City, Los Angeles, the United Kingdom, Canada, the European Union, have already declared a climate emergency. Taking swift, bold action to acknowledge, mobilize for, and solve the climate emergency is in full and complete alignment with the language and context of Article 11, Section 1 of the Constitution of Virginia, which states, "It shall be the Commonwealth's policy to protect its atmosphere, lands, and waters from pollution, impairment, or destruction for the benefit, enjoyment, and general welfare of the people of the Commonwealth." A part of a document that all elected officers swear or affirm to support. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Delegates, the Senate concurring, that the General Assembly recognize the global warming caused by human activity that increases emissions of greenhouse gases has resulted in a climate and ecological emergency. Such global warming severely and urgently affects the environment, economy, and security of Virginia and the social well-being, health, and safety of Virginians, and demands an immediate social, technological, and economic mobilization of the resources and labor of Virginia at a massive scale to halt, mitigate, reverse, and repair, and prepare for the consequences of the climate emergency and to restore the climate for future generations. And there you have it. The laundry list of our climate and ecological reality that, to me, is embarrassing to read into our legislative record a second time, no less, because our 2020 Senate body failed to take it up, bring it to the floor, and pass it unanimously last year. According to all the best climate science, we are in an emergency situation that is having disastrous consequences for numerous sectors of our economy, our health, and our safety, and our national defense. And failing to prioritize the remedies for these emergencies is insanity in our present and immoral in consideration of our children's future. But that is where decades of concerted campaigns of climate denial have brought us, to a floor fight over reality. And that's leading to the ludicrous situation of asking the bizarre question, how can we hope to advocate for solutions to the impact of climate instability if we refuse to agree on the reality and the magnitude of the crises? The significance of and I'm sorry, those last several statements were my own. The resolution itself ended on the statement that we need to reverse and prepare for the consequences of climate emergency and to restore the climate for future generations. all of that needs to be, unfortunately, said and read and declared and voted on and passed because we have significant factions of our society continuing to deny those realities. And if those individuals are denying that reality and also serving within our legislative body, it makes it very challenging then to have reasonable discussions about climate legislation, about climate action plans, if those realities are being denied. So, that's why I needed to start with that. That's why I needed to emphasize the importance of that resolution. Again, the number is House Joint Resolution 559, offered by Elizabeth Guzman. If you're not familiar with the Legislative Information Services operations, they do have a search function that I find completely antiquated and not user-friendly when it comes to trying to plug in House bills, legislative bill numbers or resolution numbers. Oftentimes, if you go to the system and you try to just put in the bill number, you get a choice of dozens of bills, and not specifically the current year. So my recommendation is, if you aren't familiar with the system and or some particular legislation, I find that the best way to try to track it, to follow it, if you don't have an organization doing that for you and you go and you do it yourself, is when you go to the main page, choose the legislator that you know is sponsoring or patroning that legislation. And if you pull them up, then you have the opportunity to look at the bills that they are either, again, patroning or co-sponsoring. And it's a much shorter list, especially this short general session. They're all limited to, like I say, 7 or 10, depending on which chamber. And you can get to those documents, you can get to the text a little more quickly. Again, if that's if you don't have an organization that you're part of that's already tracking these and giving you updates. From there, you can see which committee it gets assigned to, how it's proceeding within those committees, and if you want to, you can reach out to those actual committee members and tell them about your support of particular bills. But before I go too far along into that, let's take another quick station break. Again, we tried to announce at the top of the hour that we are WRWKLP 93.9 LP, the Work FM, licensed in Midlothian, serving Chesterfield, Enrico, Richmond, Goochland, and Hanover. I said it twice, but I don't think it got heard once, so I'm going to say it one more time. The thoughts and opinions contained in the following broadcast show are those of the host and or guests, and not the staff or volunteers of WRWK-LP-FM or the board of directors of Synergy Project. Okay, so I promise you that the rest of the bills that I'm going to address, I am not going to read them in their entirety, and we're going to try to summarize them much more quickly, much more succinctly, and afford you an opportunity to start tracking those and start contacting your legislators if you are so inclined to support them as well. Okay. Next, we're going to address the Green New Deal Act. Again, if we have formally recognized the reality and declared a state of climate and ecological emergency here in Virginia, then legislation like HB 1937, the Green New Deal Act, could become critical centerpieces to Virginia's climate action plan on decarbonizing our economy. In particular, House Bill, again, 1937, the Green New Deal Act, is sponsored by Delegate Sam Razul, again this year, and borrowing from the summary found at lis.virginia.gov, the legislation would do the following. Effective January 1st of 2022, there would be an establishment of a statewide moratorium on the approval of all electric generating facilities fueled by the combustion of fossil fuel resources, import or export terminals for fossil fuel resources, pipelines or gathering lines for the transport of any fossil fuel resources that require the use of eminent domain on private property, refineries of fossil fuel resources, and exploration for any type of fossil fuel unless preempted by applicable federal law. If you're going to decarbonize and reduce your emissions that are as a majority produced by the burning of fossil fuels, the first step is to stop burning those fossil fuels. Stop making plans to produce more fossil fuels. If you're going to transition to a clean economy, that means you got to get off of what you're doing. So, and in the time frames that have been laid out, if we need to get to half of what we're producing, say, by 2030, and completely zeroing out our emissions in the next couple decades after that, why would you build new infrastructure that is not cheap, quite expensive, and typically designed to be in operation for decades if you need to stop doing it inside a decade, I would argue. So it only makes sense that the very top of the plan needs to be no more of this stuff, no more new stuff, and a moratorium needs to be implemented. And so the Green New Deal Act calls for that. The Act also requires that at least 80% of the electricity sold by a retail electric supplier be generated from clean energy resources during the years of 2028 through 2035 and 100% thereafter. That's a faster timeline than the current supposed Clean Economy Act that was passed last year. That moves the clock up a bit more in line with what the science demands about how quickly we need to move off of fossil fuels, stop generating those emissions from burning fossil fuels, and get ourselves decarbonized so that we can avoid the warming that's projected by the continuance of this. Okay. The clean energy mandates apply to public utilities or persons that sell more than 1,000 megawatt hours of electric generation to retail customers or for use of said persons. The Act sets the Director of Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy as empowered to bring action for injunctions to enforce these requirements, and if any retail electric supplier fails to meet any goal or benchmark, there's a price. The Act provides for a civil penalty equal to twice the cost of the financial investment necessary to meet the goal or mandate that was not achieved, or 3 times if the cost is not met in the environmental justice communities. So, anyone arguing for or proposing the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in this decade, which is designed to operate again for decades, is arguing for the continuance of global warming and climate catastrophes. Not to mention stranded assets and completely avoidable financial debts and burdens for utility sector investors and consumers as we transition to a decarbonized economy. Why? Because we've recognized and declared a climate and ecological emergency that warrants immediate and decisive action to eliminate the production of massive amounts of greenhouse gases and remove those emissions already added to our atmosphere that have caused the destructive global warming of the past several decades. The Green New Deal Act also requires that a climate action plan be adopted that addresses all aspects of climate change, including mitigation, adaptation, resiliency, and assistance in the transition from current energy sources to clean renewable energy. And where are we going to find those agreed upon aspects of climate change? I would argue that House Resolution 559, for starters, and all the fact-based, scientifically researched, government-authorized reports and analyses that it references would be a very good starting point. To continue, the Act also establishes a goal of a 36% reduction of electric energy consumption in buildings by 2036. 36 and 36, that's kind of easy to remember. And the Act requires the establishment of the Transitioning Workers Program to provide support for workers in the fossil fuel industry, including job training, relocation support, income and benefit support, and early retirement benefits. The Act provides for the funding of such a program by 20% of the revenues generated by the allowance auction established by the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And finally, the Act increases the incremental energy efficiency savings that each investor-owned incumbent electric utility is required to achieve starting in 2022. I did not manage to get back and try to dig through the Clean Economy Act and what those requirements are, but I'm guessing they probably were potentially not as significant as that, and so that again potentially steps up the pace of our transition. Okay. So, again, the bill is sponsored by Delegate Sam Razul and currently co-patroned by Delegate Joshua Cole, Patrick Hope, Chris Hurst, Mark Keene, Kay Corey, Kenneth Plum, Ibrahim Samira, and Marcus Simon. So, if you didn't hear your delegate's name in that list, I suggest you give them a call or write them a letter and tell them what you think. Given the time frame, if at all possible, make that an email. And the folks at Green New Deal Virginia would be glad to help you with that. They've got some form letters that they're working on for most of their legislation, as well as quick call scripts and numbers. So let's do that.
Who's that?
That's the Green New Deal Virginia. You can find them, I believe, at greennewdealva.com for some reason, not .org. So they've got a website. They've got a significant social media presence. They're posting daily, if not hourly, now that we're in session probably, with updates on some of this legislation. And, of course, the Green New Deal Act is sort of their centerpiece, but there's other legislation that they can help you with, too. I might hit on some of that as I go down my list today, if I can stay on track and on time. In fact, next up is legislation that addresses our transportation sector, currently the largest emitter of greenhouse gases here in the Commonwealth. There's a bill, HB 1965, the Clean Car Standards Bill. That is sponsored by Delegate Bagby, and the bill proposes that Virginia join the 15 other states who have implemented what are called low-emission vehicle and zero-emission vehicle standards, helping to bring more electric vehicles to Virginia and reducing carbon emissions. Okay, here's a little bit of a background on the issue. When we talk about clean car standards, for anybody not aware, in 2012, the Obama administration finalized standards that would nearly double the fuel efficiency of new cars and light trucks by 2025. The Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, CAFE, C-A-F-E, and the Greenhouse Gas Emission Standards were estimated to result in the reduction of climate-disrupting pollution associated with our transportation sector by 6 billion tons and oil consumption by up to 4 million barrels a day. If we implement these standards, that's the kind of reductions and savings we can realize. Under Section 209 of the Clean Air Act, California is awarded the unique authority to maintain motor vehicle emission standards that are stricter than the federal standards, as long as the federal government issues them a waiver. California refers to its motor vehicle emission standards as the Low Emission Vehicle, or LEV standards, and as part of the larger Advanced Clean Cars program, California's Zero Emissions Vehicles, ZEVs, you'll see oftentimes abbreviated program, requires major manufacturers of passenger cars and light trucks up to 8,500 pounds to attain a certain number of EV credits depending on the number of vehicles produced and delivered for sale in the state. Section 177 of the Clean Air Act offers other states the option to adopt California's standards but not develop independent standards. I don't know exactly how all the negotiating went on that, but that's what came out of it. So, 14 states and the District of Columbia have adopted these stronger restrictions on pollution from cars, and 11 states have also adopted these zero-emission vehicle standards. The current administration attempted to sabotage that by denying California the waiver here in the last year or so, and that potentially can disrupt then the efforts of these states that represent about 118 million people, 40% of the U.S. population, and what they are attempting to do in the way of decarbonizing their transportation and getting us closer to that zero mark. So, Delegate Bagby's bill will enable Virginia to adopt these stronger standards relating to the control of emissions from new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, including the LEVs and the ZEV standards. The bill provides for the programs, again, that California has set up to be applied to the motor vehicles beginning with the 2025 model year or the first model year for which adoption of such standards is practicable. So my hope is that with the new federal administration that is about to take office next week, they will take a different course than 45 did and allow California to have that waiver for these programs that right now I guess is still in some kind of state of court battle, and reinstate that ability. And this legislation gives Virginia the opportunity to join that program, work with the other states, and get on with our own decarbonization of our transportation system, which again is the highest emitter right now. More than 50% of Virginia's greenhouse gases come from transportation. So this legislation signals to vehicle manufacturers that Virginia is serious about transitioning its transportation sector away from carbon-emitting transport and would encourage the necessary increases in production of low and zero-emissions vehicles. Another significant incentive measure for transitioning to, well, let me take I'm rushing a little bit. I'm going to take a breath, make sure that was clear. We understand. If we enact this kind of legislation, we're signaling to manufacturers that we have goals that are going to require a lot of new vehicles, a lot of new electric vehicles, a lot of new lower emission vehicles, and that increases our market share. It increases our ability to have access to these vehicles. Right now, there's a lot of dealerships. You walk onto the lot and you won't see a single one of them. Yeah, and that's why. What? That's crazy, okay? They're out there. There's a lot of them. I would argue that they're just as affordable as their counterparts, and we're going to talk about a little bit of legislation now that'll help ensure that they are competitive, and that is the incentive measure for transitioning to decarbonized economy in HB 1979. That is the Electric Vehicle Rebate Program bill, sponsored by Delegate Reed. The bill creates an equitable designed electric vehicle rebate program to increase access to EVs for all customers. I think that's the quick summary that you find at LIS. The bill would create a rebate program for the purchase or lease of new and used electric vehicles. New and used, boy, where was that when I bought my vehicle a couple years ago? A purchaser or leasee of an electric vehicle would receive $2,500 rebate at the time of purchase, and a purchaser or leasee with the annual household income of less than triple the federal poverty level would be entitled to an additional $2,000 rebate. The motor vehicle dealer where the vehicle is purchased or leased would receive a refund for the amount of the rebate plus a $50 incentive payment for each rebate process. So one more time, we're trying to motivate the industry as well as the consumer that this is a good deal, this is a good plan, let's get on with it. And the program would be paid for by the revenues generated by the sunset of the Virginia Coal Employment and Production Incentive Tax Credit. Yes, I believe that's a tax credit that encouraged Virginia coal production. I think we're done with that. So that money redirected could fund the rebate program, as well as something called Coal Field Employment Enhancement Tax Credit too. That one goes away, and this new program receives those funds. The bill establishes a program expiration date of September 1, 2026. So this is a short-term kind of thing, the next 5 years or so. But that's, again, in my mind, a good motivator. You don't have a whole decade to take advantage of that. You need to go ahead and make that conversion now. Here's your opportunity to save a little bit of money along the way. Okay. Currently, more than a dozen states offer some amount of EV rebate. Some of those states are our nearest neighbors. We, a couple weeks ago, before, I guess it was before the holidays, we attempted to have what I call a fun game night show here at Climate Watch, and we talked about I put poor Ron on the spot to see what he knew about this, all of these different offerings by states in the way of incentives to get us decarbonized in our transportation sector. And Maryland is doing a great job. We talked about them somewhat. Rhode Island, I know, is one. Delaware's got a program. So this isn't a new thing. This isn't a unique thing. There are plenty of states doing it, and Virginia needs to do it too. So we are coming up on some shortages in time as far as what I've got to talk about. So let's try to cliff note some of this. Next is the last one, I think, in our vehicle side of things, HB 2118, Electric Vehicle Grant Fund and Program. It requires that the Department of Environmental Quality establish the Electric Vehicle Grant Program for the purpose of awarding grants to on a competitive basis to school boards for assisting with the complete replacement of existing diesel school buses, for converting them to electric school buses, not later than 2031. That would be awesome. You guys know I'm all caught up in the big picture of the climate and global warming and the whole world suffering, but every day, well, not this year with COVID, but when we put our kids normally onto school buses for that commute to their local schools, typically it's a diesel-powered bus. It's got some nasty emissions. Kids should not have to be subjected to that when there are cleaner alternatives. So in any event, again, I want to say this is Delegate Keem's bill. My notes don't, somehow I managed to overlook jotting that down, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard him talk about on a call I was in on. Again, that's HB 2118, Electric Vehicle Grant Fund Program, helping us get our kids out of those dirty buses and into some clean ones. Delegate Keem, thank you. On the Senate side, there is one more transportation bill. On the Senate side, there's SB 1223, Transportation Electrification, Virginia Energy Plan, introduced by Senator Jennifer Boysko. I hope I'm saying that right. The bill amends the Virginia Energy Plan to include an analysis of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Going to have all these electric vehicles. I love charging mine at home off of my solar panels, but I am retired. I don't have to commute to work. I don't have to make long trips and get somewhere and then need to be charging a vehicle. So I know a lot of people that's not the case. You guys like to live in your vehicles. You're running all over town all the time, and wherever you do stop, it'd be nice to be able to just go ahead and plug in, get charged up, and when you're ready to go again, zoom. So the legislation looks at the overall infrastructure or lack of infrastructure right now, what we need to be doing in getting some chargers out there, some ready-made electrical equipment, and supporting all these kinds of aspects. That's what the Senate side here is trying to do, or our esteemed senator is doing in the way of SB 1223. So I hope you guys are jotting these down, preparing your list of bills to let your representatives know you think are good ideas, especially given the emergencies that we've created and the crises we need to avert. Switching gears, House Bill 2068 is a local food and farming infrastructure grant program. We've talked before about agriculture being a large generator of greenhouse gas emissions. A significant portion of that is tied to the food system as a whole, and what we call big ag, and the damage that it's doing to the soils, which again prevents the uptake of these emissions that our natural systems could be capable of. There's all the transportation, there's the packaging, there's the blah, all these kinds of things that are associated with big ag, that if we decided to have a different food system that is more focused on local food production, sustainable farming, regenerative farming, you've heard me use that term. The bill directs the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry to develop guidelines for the program that would favor projects that establish or maintain farmers markets, businesses, or organizations that manage distribution and marketing of food products primarily from local and regional producers. The grant program would be for grants for up to $25,000. I think that's a great idea. So tell your legislators what you think too. Let's see, we've got, okay, that gets me through those that you can really say this impacts the climate. One more time, both our energy generation, or all three, our energy generation systems, how we get our electricity, our transportation system, how we get around in this lovely Commonwealth, and agriculture. Those are the big three producers here in Virginia, so we need to get those addressed. But I would argue that there's also some other legislation that helps push back, combat. I'm not a confrontational kind of person normally. I don't like that kind of language, but prevent the obstructors of good climate action plans from influencing our legislation is also a significant part of the problem. And so there is House Bill 1756, a bill to ban campaign contributions from Dominion and other public service corporations. That's offered by, oh crud, who is that offered by? Maybe it says a little further down. Let me see. Virginia's, I would argue, again, abysmal campaign finance laws have allowed corporations to capitalize our political processes. So corporations like Dominion Energy have held sway over both Democrats and Republicans in our legislative and executive branches, with millions of dollars of campaign contributions for several decades. And Dominion's level of influence in the Virginia Clean Energy Act in 2020 legislation session greatly reduced Virginia's potential to create meaningful, transformative legislation to address the climate crisis. So, what do you say we end that influence by outlawing those kinds of contributions? There's also a broader bill that actually, I think I've located Delegate Samira's bill is is HB 1756. I shouldn't rush. So the bill we're talking about is HB 1756. That's Delegate Samira's bill for ending campaign contributions from these large utility corporations. Also, taking what I think is a broader approach, Delegate Lee Carter has taken it to the next level with HB 1906, Campaign Finance Prohibited Contributions from Corporations and Civil Penalty. So he's talking about all corporations from the looks of the bill to me. In summary, according to this, the bill prohibits contributions from any non-tax exempt corporation to any candidate, campaign committee, political committee, or political party committee. So the bill would impose a civil penalty of up to twice the amount of the contributions for a violation of the prohibition, to be leveled and collected by the State Board of Elections. Get the big money out of our legislators' influences and let this be a government of, by, and for the people. All right, Ron's telling me I've got just a couple of minutes left. I think I'm down to just about the last bill that I located on the Senate side. It's Senate Bill 1373, Environmental Permits, Community and Environmental Justice Outreach. So it doesn't necessarily specifically speak to addressing climate change, but it does speak to addressing the environmental impacts that an awful lot of people have suffered from as a result of us getting this cheap, dirty energy produced around their communities. I'm going to leave it at that and tell you to look up the details on that. That's being introduced by Senator Jennifer McClellan, and I think it's a worthwhile bill because it seeks to empower the communities in the process of these proposed industries, businesses, whatever, that might be producing some pollution and might be impacting their communities and giving them a more significant say. So, how are we going to end this? In 1 minute, I'm going to tell you that if I haven't motivated you enough yet, there's a couple of scary reports that you can take a look at that just came out this week. One is found in a publication called frontiersin.org. It summarizes the ghastly future of mass extinction, declining health, and climate disruption and upheaval. They had a wicked title to it called, let me find that. Let's see. Shoot. Way up at the top here, it's called, the article itself is called Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future. Some very reputable colleges, universities, whatever's participated in this, and it's terrifying. Also, the rate of warming is increasing, and the whole terrifying truth is compellingly recounted at phys.org. About the the Earth is set to reach temperature tipping points in the next 20 to 30 years, and that probably hasn't made it into most U.S. news feeds, but it should every day, and you guys should know about it, and you should be motivated by it. All right, I sped through the hour. There we are. Next up, Democracy Now! Thanks, Ron, for keeping me on point.
Yes, that's good. I put a lot of notes in the comments, and you can always go to Lobbyist in a Box and subscribe, which I plan to do so I can monitor these for us.
That's right.
Help us track these things, because it's only a 30-day session this week?
Exactly,
This year, yeah.
exactly. Unless there's a nice extension that the Republicans are, many legislators are trying to squelch
Well,
the
yeah.
possibility of an extension.
Well, I hope it works out, because we have a lot of business this year that we never expected.
No, yeah.
Never
Lot to deal with, lot to look out for.
Yep. We do
Keep
that.
track of.
Okay, so I guess it's time to let Amy loose on them. Okay, folks.
Yeah. Thanks for listening,
Fasten your
guys.
seatbelts.
Have a good evening.
All right. Here goes Amy, and bye-bye to our loving crowd.